There is a moment, if you spend enough time near any food court in suburban Australia, when you will lock eyes with one. It will be standing on a bin, or possibly inside one, holding a piece of chicken bone in its curved beak, completely unbothered by your disgust. It will not flinch. It will not apologize. It will simply look at you with one orange-rimmed eye and continue. And if you knew what this bird had survived to get here, you might reconsider which of you is the more impressive animal. The Australian White Ibis, Thresciornis molluca, is one of the most studied urban wildlife stories in this country, and also one of the most comprehensively misunderstood. Research from the University of Sydney, UNSW, Macquarie University, and the Queensland Wader Study Group has spent the better part of 2 decades unpicking how a bird virtually absent from our cities in the 1970s now numbers in the hundreds of thousands along the East Coast. The story is not about a species that went feral. It is about a species that was pushed. And what it did once it arrived in our suburbs tells us something uncomfortable about intelligence, survival, and which of us is actually adapting better to the world we are building. Let's start where the ibis started, in the interior. Before the food courts and council complaints and the memes, the Australian white ibis was predominantly an inland bird. It bred in massive colonial nesting events in the Macquarie Marshes of New South Wales, the Barmah-Millewa forests along the Murray River, the Cooper Creek floodplain in Western Queensland. These are some of the most productive temporary wetland systems on the continent. Not permanent water bodies, but episodic floods that, when they arrived, triggered an explosion of invertebrate and fish life capable of sustaining enormous bird colonies for months at a stretch. Researchers from the University of New England estimated that in the mid-20th century, a single breeding event at Macquarie Marshes could involve between 30 and 40,000 nesting pairs. That is not a marginal species holding on at the edges of a functioning ecosystem. That is a species at the center of one. Then we drained it. Systematically, deliberately, and with full legal sanction. Irrigation diversions from the Darling and Murray systems progressively reduced and destabilized the flooding cycles that triggered ibis breeding. The Macquarie Marshes, a wetland listed under the Ramsar Convention as internationally significant, lost more than half their total extent to drainage works and upstream water extraction between the 1940s and the 1990s. Colonial water birds like the ibis require flood events that persist across the entire nesting cycle, roughly 4 months from arrival to fledging. Disrupt the flood, or make it too unpredictable to rely on, and a colony cannot complete a breeding season. Repeat that disruption across enough years, and a population that has relied on a given wetland system for millennia faces a binary problem. That system no longer functions. The ibis colonies that had anchored themselves to inland Australia for tens of thousands of years suddenly had nowhere viable to go. So they went to Sydney, then Brisbane, then Melbourne. The movement was documented in real time by ornithologists who initially struggled to characterize what they were watching. UNSW researchers tracking East Coast ibis populations noted a marked and sustained increase in urban birds from the early 1990s onward. By 2002, a targeted survey across Greater Sydney found over 11,000 ibis in urban and peri-urban environments. By the mid-2010s, estimates for the Greater Sydney Basin alone approached 25,000. And critically, the researchers found that urban ibis were not simply passing through on their way to somewhere better. They were establishing breeding colonies in botanic gardens, suburban parklands, and golf course wetlands. They were learning bin collection schedules. They were identifying which cafe precincts left out the most unsecured waste and returning to them with consistency. These birds did not arrive because cities are preferable to ancient floodplains. They arrived because the floodplains had been made uninhabitable, and cities were what remained. Here is where the intelligence story starts to demand serious attention. Surviving in a city requires a fundamentally different cognitive toolkit than surviving in a seasonal wetland. A Macquarie University study examining problem-solving performance in urban-dwelling Australian white ibis compared to birds from non-urban populations found that the urban birds outperformed on novel object interaction, multi-step food access tasks, and lid removal problems, not marginally, but by a significant margin. The researchers were measured in their interpretation, as they should be. The result could reflect selective pressure across 3 decades of urban living. Individuals best equipped to solve novel problems thrived, bred, and passed those tendencies on. It could also reflect individual learning across a lifetime of exposure to a cognitively demanding environment. Most likely, it is both processes operating simultaneously. What it is not is coincidence. The bird standing in your bin is not a degraded or corrupted version of a wild animal. It is a cognitively flexible generalist that has been solving novel problems daily for 30 years, and it is getting better at it. And we have been escalating those problems while loudly complaining about the results. The treatment of urban ibis in Australia ranges from passive contempt to active, legally sanctioned population suppression, and very little of it is working. Egg oiling, coating eggs in paraffin or corn oil to prevent hatching, is practiced by local councils across New South Wales and Queensland as a standard management tool. It is legal, it is widespread, and research from the University of Sydney's Faculty of Science found no significant long-term reduction in ibis numbers at sites where egg oiling was consistently applied over a 5-year monitoring period. The birds relocated. They re-nested elsewhere within the urban matrix. The population absorbed the intervention without detectable response at the regional scale. Meanwhile, the pest control industry continues to market something they call humane ibis relocation to councils and commercial landowners. Let's be precise about what relocation means for a highly social, site-faithful species. Birds are trapped in familiar urban territories, transported to release sites where they have no established social network, no knowledge of food sources, and no territorial foothold. Survival data from post-relocation ibis operations has not been rigorously published by the companies performing these services. The use of the word humane is doing significant work that it has not earned. What ibis are actually doing in urban environments, when they are not doing the thing that generates the content, is more ecologically consequential than the bin raiding highlight reel suggests. White ibis are generalist invertebrate feeders. Earthworms, grubs, freshwater crustaceans, small reptiles, and in certain contexts, amphibian larvae. In urban parklands and managed wetlands, they function as active soil aerators and opportunistic pest suppressors. A review of urban waterbird ecology, published in Avian Conservation and Ecology, noted that ibis and related threskiornithids in urban wetland systems actively suppress populations of invasive invertebrates, with documented predation on cane-toed tadpoles recorded in Queensland waterways. The ecological contribution is real. It is simply invisible because it occurs in the grass and shallow water rather than on top of a bin in front of a camera. There is also a social dimension to this species that public conversation about ibis ignores almost entirely. Australian White Ibis live in structured social groups with documented partner fidelity across multiple breeding seasons. Adults have been observed provisioning juveniles outside their own brood, behavior that points towards something more complex than straightforward reproductive arithmetic. A University of Queensland field study tracking individually marked birds in southeast Queensland found that ibis maintained consistent social associations over periods exceeding 3 years. These are not anonymous mobs of scavengers occupying shared space by accident. They are communities of individuals with established relationships, persistent histories, and recognized identities within the group. The bird you step around in Circular Quay is known to other birds. It has a reputation, in the only sense that actually matters to them. Other ibis know exactly who it is and what it does. The cultural mockery of the Australian White Ibis is one of the stranger disconnects in a country that nominally respects the underdog. This is a native species. It holds protected status under the Biodiversity Conservation Act 2016 in New South Wales, and under equivalent legislation in every other state and territory. It did not choose the city, it chose survival, in the only environment that remained viable after the wetland systems it had relied on for tens of thousands of years were progressively rendered non-functional by irrigation extraction, land clearing, and water policy written without birds as a variable. Calling it a bin chicken is not harmless irreverence. It is a quiet transfer of accountability, away from the water management decisions and agricultural engineering that destroyed its habitat, and onto the animal that had the audacity to survive them. If ibis are part of your local environment, and in any Eastern Australian metropolitan area, they almost certainly are, a few things are worth knowing. Do not feed them directly. It is not kindness. It concentrates birds in areas that generate complaints and escalate management responses that are expensive, ethically ambiguous, and demonstrably ineffective. If you want to do something with measurable impact, support wetland restoration advocacy in your region. The Living Murray Initiative and the Macquarie Marshes Conservation Program have both produced measurable responses in colonial waterbird breeding activity when environmental flows are restored to functional levels. When ibis can breed inland, urban population pressure decreases. The city was never the destination. It was the refuge of last resort. And if a council or a pest operator in your area is running egg oiling programs without publishing population monitoring data alongside them, ask for the data. Ask what metric they are using for success. Ask whether it has been achieved. Because 30 years of urban ibis management in this country has produced one clear lesson. Contempt is not a conservation strategy. Next time, we look at another native that has been living alongside us far longer. A species that didn't arrive in our suburbs out of desperation, but out of something that looks uncomfortably like deliberate choice. Subscribe, and we'll get into exactly what it's been doing here.